Hello again, this is Dan Baldwin, and today we're talking to Charles Carr with Telecom IT and Cloud Lawyer Law Firm, and we're talking to them about the top things to look out for in service agreements. This interview is primarily for CIOs and IT directors of multi-location businesses who are signing these agreements, and also the consultants or partners that are, causing these agreements to be presented. So, Charles, thanks for talking to our audience today.
You bet, Dan. Glad to be here, and hopefully we can add some value to your customers and viewers.
Great. Well, now what we're talking about today is service agreements, and one of the top things that people always want to know is that business downturn language. Tell us, if they're signing up for a commitment of, X dollars per month for X number of years, they always want to know, well, what happens if business goes south? Tell us a little bit about business downturn language, whether that's ever, amended, or what are the things to concern yourself before you sign the agreement.
Sure, I would offer that Ben Bronston, who has started this firm and has been in this space for a long time, um, was one of the early adopters of that sort of clause in enterprise end user service agreements, and it's becoming more widely accepted, and I think there are several large providers who actually include it in their standard form now. So it's not something that you have to redline in and then convince a provider to actually include it. And I think the downturn of 2008 in the financial sector and how that impacted businesses, uh, not just in the United States, but globally, led everybody to believe that you have to have some relief for long-term contracts, especially when there's a MAC or a minimum annual commitment for which you're responsible for the shortfall if your overall service spend doesn't reach that. Clearly in 2020, everybody can appreciate the importance of having a business downturn clause in your contract. Now, how that looks and how it's implemented and how it's defined and what sort of relief you get, those are all sort of the negotiable points. But it's pretty common now to get one into a enterprise long-term contract. And if there's not one in there, clearly you should seek legal counsel and get one inserted.
And that kind of takes us to our next topic. If you don't have a good business downturn language clause, then you're going to be looking at early termination fees. Talk to us about early termination fees, how they're calculated, and what you should be negotiating in regarding ETFs.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and it's clearly a very important component to the business downturn environment or any sort of force majeure or unforeseen circumstance where you end up having to terminate an agreement early. It's also related to when you get into a contract, and we see this from time to time, where the services are not performing in a way that you expected, and or the provider that you initially contracted with is acquired, and all of a sudden your customer service and overall performance of the business relationship is somehow impacted because of an acquisition or a divestiture from the provider that you originally contracted with. So early termination fees are usually invoked when the customer themselves somehow terminates the contract or component of the service prior to the end of the contracted term. Ordinarily, you are going to negotiate discounts and or a waiver of upfront installation fees and or engineering costs of a network or something like that. In consideration for a longer term contract with the provider. And so they're looking at least in the initial term, that if you terminate early, well, they've written off some upfront installation costs, maybe some networking fees, and or some discounts on the monthly services that they need to recoup. And I think everybody can sort of understand that. The key, you're never going to completely eliminate an early termination fee in any contract unless you have huge amounts of leverage, or you have what's called a minimum annual commitment, as we talked about earlier. So the early termination fee, what that looks like is, in what circumstances can it be invoked? Under what circumstances can the customer walk away without any early termination fee? And then how does it change over time? Usually what we try to do is get it into some sort of graduated decline, so that in the initial year, you have to pay any waived installation costs, and then any remainder of the monthly recurring costs for the first year, and then maybe a reduced percentage of those for the second and third year, assuming that you're in a standard 3-year term. And then under what circumstances those are not going to apply. And we can talk about some of the defenses when you terminate either a whole agreement or a component of the agreement early, and you get a invoice for the early termination fee. And there are some ways that you can negotiate out of those, and we can talk about those.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. Let's move on to item number 3, and that is remedies. What are the different remedies that you would be looking for both early termination or any of the other items where there's a lack of performance on either the customer or the carrier?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that we've dealt with over the years to varying degrees. A provider is always going to want to limit the remedies for any service-related performance issues, a failure to meet their uptime, dropped calls, downtime on their platforms, uh, any sort of issue related to the actual provision of the service. They're always going to try to limit that to a schedule of what they call outage credits, and there's usually formulas that are built in to allow you to, claim some sort of credits on your monthly invoices based on the fact that your services weren't working properly or you were down. The problem is that they do have this language that you have to try to negotiate out in every instance, that the outage credits are your sole remedy for any sort of service issues. And the way we approach that is we try to get what's called chronic outage or chronic service interruption or something like that, where it's just beyond a glitch in the system or a cut line in the street or something like that that's outside of the service provider's control. And that will, when you have a chronic service exception to the standard SLA, then you get into what does that look like? What are the components of that? What are the metrics that define it as a chronic problem? And then at what level does it allow you to walk away from the contract without any early termination fees and not merely being subject to these service credits on the SLA? By way of example, we had a client many years ago who was in Colorado, whose system was being provided by an underlying ILEC, and they worked through the reseller, and the underlying ILEC had a massive um, down system, and our client lost their phones for 3 days, and there was no relief in sight. And so they had to bring in an emergency network IT company to set up a backup phone system through the internet. They got a backup internet service. They set up a VoIP service in order to reinstate their phones, and so they could at least conduct business while this was being resolved between the reseller and the underlying island. At the end of the day, they said, well, we want our costs recouped. I think they spent about 15,000 on setting up this emergency backup phone system. And their provider came back and said, no, you're only entitled to your SLA remedies, and they offered them $400 in outage credits. Our client was so outraged that they ended up filing a suit, and I think she told me, I don't care if it costs me $100,000 to sue these people for a $15,000 claim. It's a matter of principle. So that's that's a war story that these things can have real life impacts, and getting a chronic service outage insert and exception or carve out to your standard SLA outage remedies is critical importance.
Hmm. Well, let's go on to our fourth item because we're talking about service interruptions, and you mentioned out of the ordinary. How does anybody define ordinary? And this is like beyond the pale.
Yeah, it's a it's easier now to sort of quantify, what is a chronic service interruption. And, now we have most phone services that operate on an internet uh, transmission system. And so having a uptime on your internet is always going to be of critical importance to your phone system as well. And so, there's the providers of phone systems will always, especially in a VoIP environment, will always have limitations, liability related to, if you're not using us for your underlying internet access and your internet goes out, well, that's not our fault if your phones don't work. But it's pretty easy to come up with an agreeable quantification of, what a chronic service criteria is. It's usually, certain amount of times of hours in the day and days of the week and weeks of the month. And, there's usually some aggregate. And if it reaches those levels, then it's considered, chronic service interruption. And hopefully it allows a customer to walk at that point. They can terminate. And there's some contract law issues that come in there. Frustrated purpose. You enter into a service contract. Let's face it, business owners, they just want their internet and phones to work.
Hmm.
They're not really concerned about what's going on behind the scenes, or, they just want their stuff to work so they can sell their widgets or whatever business they're in. And they're not too interested in listening to the excuses of service providers about why their phones don't work and why their internet has gone down. So, in the end, it's important to pay attention to these things, because the most frustrated calls we get are customers who are not happy with their services, but they are tied to a contract that they can't get out of without paying early termination fees.
Hmm. All right, we talked a little bit about our next topic, minimum commitments. Let's go to our final topic, which is everyone's favorite, billing disputes. So if a customer has had a poor experience, then the last thing that they can do is simply not pay. Tell us of all of the billing disputes that you've been involved with. What can you not get out of, and what is reasonable to withhold? And then how do you adjudicate that or split the difference?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it keeps the lawyers both internally at the providers as well as in contract disputes busy all the time. And it's a healthy portion of our dispute resolution business. Ben and I are not litigators. We don't get involved in lawsuits, but we do a lot of negotiated resolutions to billing issues. So let's sort of walk through what some of those look like. Some are just services have been terminated, overbilling situations where either the billing is adding things that were never hooked up or were terminated and they continued to bill. That happens sometimes with some of the larger carriers. Without singling anybody out, there are just some internal mechanisms at some very large carriers where when you terminate a service, nobody wants to take it off the billing account, because they have some financial incentives to keep those bills rolling. And even if it causes headaches for the customer to have to fight them, and let's face it, some customers just don't look at them. That's why the telecom expense management or TEM business rose, is because a lot of people were paying their bills for a long time without really evaluating. So that's one billing dispute, is when you're being overbilled or charged for things that you're not receiving. Those you just have to fight the fight, and there are some informal complaints you can file at state and FCC level, and usually it's just a matter of being a bulldog and proving your case. But sometimes they go into collection, and then you're going to have to make a decision about whether to hire a lawyer or not to resolve it. That always depends on the dollar amount in controversy. Some people are willing to let a few $1,000s go into collection, and then just ignore it. For early termination fees, or some of the other things, like when you have a bill for when your network gets hacked and they run up, $50,000 in fraudulent calls. Those sorts of things can be tricky to get out of, but there are some legal defenses, and hiring a lawyer at that point is a good idea, especially if there's a large dollar amount in controversy. Early termination fees, it almost always depends on whether or not it's in an initial term or a renewal term. There are some arguments we have been successful with that when you terminate an agreement that had early termination fees, but you're doing it during a renewal term, not the initial term, that there was no expectation when that 3-year term contract was signed that they would ever renew it beyond the 3 years. So to hold somebody accountable for an early termination fee in a renewal term, they don't have what's called the expectation damages. And we've had some success. Usually those are negotiated resolutions where, the amount initially may be $20,000, and if we can get the client out for $5,000 and everybody can walk away, those usually settle for a much lower amount, because nobody wants to spend the time and expense to litigate a $20,000 to $50,000 early termination fee. Sometimes the billing disputes revolve around the auto renew. And I would just advise your listeners to make sure they monitor all of their contracts and calendar those auto renew notice dates meticulously, because many of the calls we get are from agents who are working with customers who they don't like their provider. They're going to send out an RFP for new services. They look at their contract and, oh no, it just auto renewed a couple months ago for another 3-year term or 2-year term or 1-year term. And now what do they do? And so the auto renew creates a whole new set of sort of issues that you have to deal with. So calendar those 90 days, 60 days, or 30 days when you have a contract that is subject to an auto renew clause, and be very careful about that.
Great. This is Dan Baldwin, and we've been talking to Charles Carr, who's with the Telecom IT and Cloud Lawyer law firm. Charles, we really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us today, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon in the future.
Thank you, Dan.